awards.
All right, great.
Very precious to us. Of course. Hi. So nice to meet you. Okay, everyone, so this is Justice Jennifer Brunner. She is the lone Democratic justice on our Ohio Supreme Court.
I kind of cracked up when I saw that picture. That's from 2014. And my niece is the photographer, and she showed up to my house on a Sunday morning, and I had just rolled out of bed, and she looked at me and she said, do we need to reschedule? I said, no, I can fix myself up. Don't worry, Abby. And so anyways, when this ended up on a billboard, she said, you mean my photo's going on a billboard? And at that point in time, my granddaughter was maybe 3 years old. And so I took her to where the billboard was. I said, look, who's that, Maddie? Me, Mom. So now she's 14. But anyways, I'm so glad that you all are willing to brave the cold to be out here today and to be informed early on about these races. So I have been around for a long time. I was first elected Common Pleas Court Judge in 2000 in Franklin County. And during that time, I started at the Adult Felony Drug Court in 2004. So that has been in operation for almost 22 years. And it's doing very well. It was a very difficult thing to start in a county where I was. At the time when I was elected, I think I was the 5th Democrat on a court of 16 judges and the 5th woman on a court of 16 judges. And that court is now, I think, all but one Republican, or all but one Democrat. There's only one Republican left on that court, which kind of shows you how Franklin County changed from a very red county to a very blue county. And I remember the first time I campaigned in Cuyahoga County when I was running in 2006, 2005, and 6 for Secretary of State. The people in Cuyahoga County said, why aren't you putting Democrat on your literature? And I said, well, I'm from Franklin County. You don't really say if you're a Democrat. You know, things have changed. And I say these things because I'm now on a court of 7 justices. When I was elected, it made the court 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans. Oftentimes, the Chief Justice, Maureen O'Connor, was really more progressive in voting with the Democrats or dragging the Democrats along when it came to redistricting. When she left, I ran for Chief Justice, and so in between being elected to the Supreme Court in 2020, I was elected Secretary of State, and then later on to the 10th District Court of Appeals. But when I got to the Supreme Court and Maureen was leaving, she asked me, a Republican asked me if I would run for Chief Justice, which I did. And about 2 weeks after I announced my race for Chief Justice, or my candidacy for Chief Justice, the legislature changed the law and decided to put party label on the ballot for appeals court judges. Now, what had happened in 2020 was I had won. That put things perilously close for the Republicans not to be able to feel like they had control of the 3 branches of government. And at the same time, a majority of the judges of all the courts of appeals of the state were Democratic. So this was a very political move by the legislature. We didn't know how it was going to be, and I sadly in 2022 and again in 2024, we watched very good Democratic and Republican Court of Appeals judges either not run for re-election or be beat, some after serving for over 20 years, just because of that party label on the ballot. My colleagues, Mike Donnelly and Melody Stewart, who had been elected to the Ohio Supreme Court initially in 2018, even though no other Democrats were elected statewide, they were defeated handily, and so that left me as the lone Democratic justice on the Supreme Court. I didn't think this was right, and I figured that I was in the best position to be able to fight this. So on election day in 2023, I filed a federal lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of the party label on the ballot for judges because of free speech concerns. I mean, for instance, if you had a Republican judge who was on the Court of Appeals or running for the Court of Appeals who happened to be pro-choice, Democrats might assume that they were not pro-choice, or vice versa. It could be any number of issues, whether it was gun control, the hot button issues, and judges are not permitted to really speak their minds on questions that could come before them, or they would have to recuse in hearing the case, and that's not doing their job. And the reason that you want judges to not have a party label on the ballot is you want to try to learn enough about them, about what their skills and outlook is as a judge, because you never want to walk into court when somebody already has the decision written. You want them to be able to listen objectively to both sides of the argument, to be well versed in the law, and to understand enough about the law that whatever they decide in the case is not result-oriented, but looking to the future of the law and how it's going to be applied in other situations. I know oftentimes I will think about where we might be going in making our decision and realize, this could be misconstrued if we say too much here. That idea of judicial restraint. If we go out and gratuitously offer an opinion on something that's not really before us, that could be misapplied in some other case. And, my colleagues are very, very strong in talking about we don't legislate from the bench. And what they mean by that is we're not going to make up a policy when the policy questions are within the purview, within the decisions of the legislature. Yet, when they want to get a particular result, they oftentimes do legislate from the bench. And oftentimes I am the only person who is dissenting, who is disagreeing with the majority opinion. I have no problem with that, because as I see the law fairly, there's more than one way to climb the mountain, and if they got there a certain way, and I disagree with how they got there because of the ramifications that may create for ordinary people, I will try to show a different way to climb the mountain, and in the future, some other paid decision maker who is a judge or a justice may look at my reasoning and say, that was the better way to go. And at that point in time, we'll have a little different nuance to the society, we'll have different people making the decision, and maybe I laid tracks for the future. And there are times when I will say, sorry, I cannot go in this direction. And they will look at me and say, what are you gonna write? Because what happens sometimes is if I just write a straight up decision like, disagreeing with a finding that nitrogen gas is not toxic when they're putting people to death with nitrogen in Alabama and suggesting it as a backup for Ohio. And their reasoning is that, well, nitrogen is part of ambient air, so in and of itself it may not be toxic. And we're going to grab from the US Supreme Court idea of redundancy, that we cannot read this rule in this particular way because it would be redundant. I'm like, does your back hurt from bending around and twisting 5 different ways when you don't need to? I don't always say that, but there are times when I say, why do you want to do this? You know what you're going to look like? Because that's the other piece about the judiciary. We don't have the purse like the legislature. We don't have the National Guard like the governor. All we have are our words. And our words are all that we have to allow and try to make sure that people trust in what we do. And the more they trust in what we do, whether especially it's that way with democracy too. Democracy and the judiciary are 2 of the strongest pillars to maintain a rule of law and a strong democracy. And if we use our words in the right way so that the law is clear and evident and it's fair, then people have more trust in our ability to make things right. I had always felt, as an attorney, and I'm never one of those attorneys who says, makes jokes about being an attorney, because I guess from the work I've done overseas in Serbia, Sri Lanka, Benin, remotely in Kazakhstan, and in Egypt, doing election observation, I understand what the rule of law means. the rule of law is not what you hear from Donald Trump and ICE about the strong rule of the law. I mean, God forbid. The rule of law is this concept where we believe in something greater than ourselves, that we realize if we all, and it works well, and we do things together in the right way, and we have people exercising that rule of law who we can trust, it is the way that we keep our democracy going. It is, when done well, something that keeps us safe, something that keeps things predictable, and something that is a springboard for that pursuit of happiness that we're going to celebrate 250 years of in this year, that's in our very Declaration of Independence. So, having seen countries that struggle with that rule of law, that have insane amounts of corruption, that I can remember my first trip to Serbia working with USAID was in 2012. Their unemployment rate was 25%. A man who was an air traffic controller had to also be a massage therapist on the side. And a reporter whose wife wanted to get a job at a public school had to pay the principal $3,000 in order to give his wife that job. And he regretted having to do it, but he said, at least I can publicize it. Or a woman who wanted to have a baby in a hospital with state-provided health insurance had to still pay her doctor €2,500 so he could put her in a room with 2 women instead of 6, and she would get well baby care for her baby. That is not the life that we want. And so, what I say to you is, you're here. There are a lot of people who couldn't be here because of the weather, but there are a lot of people who didn't care enough to be here. And the thing that we have to remember is that there's a reason that we fight. And even though we say maybe we'll sit this one out, or we think maybe we just have to wait out 3 more years of a presidency that's tearing apart our democracy, no, we don't do that, because there's the hate and there's the fear out there, and if we don't fight, it could change us. And that's why we fight. And we fight. Look, I was just watching 3 different videos of the shooting of the 37-year-old man in Minneapolis. And I watched the 3rd video, showed the officers kicking him, pounding him, and when he was on the ground is when they shot him. That is not America. And so, here's what I say though, because with the chaos that's out there, and I'll give you a quick little story. Years ago, when Vern Reif was Speaker of the Ohio House, this is way back in the 80s and the 90s, or early 90s, I was talking to a lobbyist because my job was to be Sherrod Brown, who was Secretary of State, was to be his legislative person. And Vern Reif thought Sherrod Brown was a big hippie, and he didn't like him. And because there was a rump caucus that existed at the time. And so I'm asking Paul Tips, who was the state party chair years ago, who was then, by that time, a premier lobbyist, Paul, what do I do? And he said, Jennifer, you gotta remember one thing. Vern can only be mad at 5 people at a time, because that's too much else to keep track of, and sooner or later you're gonna fall off the list. And it's true. And so, when I was Secretary of State, I said, Paul was exactly right. And so I never was gonna be mad at more than 5 people at a time. But Donald Trump is like on a rotating machine with a machine gun over and over and over again. And that's the kind of chaos that we and the people around him are dealing with every day. But the point is, so you think like, what do I do? What do I do? So when I became the last Democrat on the Ohio Supreme Court, I said, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. That is not original to me. I found it as a quote from Arthur Ashe, the tennis player, who must have not had the easiest time being black playing tennis at the time that he was, quite a good champion. And you know what? I found that it really works. And so whether you can just be in a No Kings protest every weekend here in town, or whether you can work on someone's campaign, or whether you can letter write, start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. When a lot of people do that, the result is greater than the sum of its parts. And I've seen what's been happening in Ohio especially in more remote areas like this, where all of Fremont Democrats win. All of Lake County, this is in 2023 or 2025, all of Democrats win. Columbiana County, where Rick and I, by the way, my husband's right back over here, and he doesn't want to give you his first name, he always writes Mr. Jennifer Brunner. but you know, Columbiana County, which I won in 2006, I think I won it in 2020, didn't I, Rick? But you know, it had been so red but in 2025, the county chair had to have a list in front of him to remember all the names of the Democrats who won. There's something afoot, and we can go ahead and build on that. And even if I wouldn't win some of these counties who are here today, if I lower my margins, it all adds up. You know, any more, you can't count on Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati to have the turnout that we need in order for Democrats to win in Ohio. But if we can make the impact all over the state and turn something light blue or light pink, it works. It all adds up, because it's just, in my case, you know, in most of the cases it's 50% plus one unless there's an independent running. And in my case, there's 4 people running in a primary, at least 4, to take me on. At least my colleague who was going to run against me in the middle of his term dropped out. I sort of called him a big dealer, and he chickened out. So he got a lot of criticism. So you know, it's doable for Ohio. I'm excited about the candidates who are running at the top of the ticket. Some people consider me to be at the top of the ticket because of my years of campaigning statewide. This is my 5th statewide race, and if I'll be glad to be considered at the top of the ticket if I can help bring home a robust change to the state that you and I love so much. So thank you very much.
So I just want to say thank you so much for those words, because I know a lot of folks here, we're tired, and you know, we're putting things on like this, and we're working hard to try to get people engaged. And it can feel defeating sometimes, and I love the theory of do what you can, and just, you know, be where you are, do what you can, and that's what we're doing here tonight. All the volunteers who made this happen tonight, thank you so much for doing that, and thank you for the wonderful words of encouragement. So we've got a question from the audience. Very apt for today, and the awful news today. Is it still safe to be a protester? Are there still laws that actually will protect us?
I don't know. I mean, Kent State, let's go back to that one. I think you have to be smart. I think the people who have been deputized to be police with ICE, a lot of people are saying they have not been adequately trained. And I think, you know, it's just like, it's like, I hate to make the analogy, but if it's a dog you don't know, and you don't know how well they're trained, you're cautious, right? You don't put your hand over their head like this, you give them this so they can sniff you. So with these folks, I mean, hopefully I'm not gonna show up here, but I think, my sense that and even watching and observing as I did after George Floyd in 2020, is those officers are afraid. And so you just have to use common sense. You're allowed to speak freely, but I wouldn't engage. And it's gonna, and who prosecutes any kind of misfortunate thing like what's happened twice now in Minneapolis. Ironically, George Floyd was Minneapolis, and these 2 things were Minneapolis. And I don't think that's really a coincidence, because I feel like there was a targeting in Minneapolis because of George Floyd, because of Tim Walz, and you know, and then, you know, again, you lost the Minnesota legislators there toward the end of last year. But you know, and so the question is, who prosecutes? Is it, if it's the local police, if it's state BCI, or if it's federal authorities? And you just saw the FBI person, you know, quit in the office up in Minnesota because they were being asked to prosecute this almost against the woman, Renee Nicole Good, who was shot, and they just said, I can't do that. So I wouldn't say don't protest, but I'd say be smart in how you do. Because you have to remember with a bullet, even if you shoot a bullet in the air, it comes down fast, and when bullets ricochet, they ricochet almost at the same speed that they hit the initial, if it hits a step and ricochets someplace else. I just know this from my trial judge days. If you don't want to be out on a street protesting, because physically sometimes people can't do it, you can write letters, you can post things on social media. You can write letters to your neighbors if you want to. And then you can work collectively, as I know a lot of people do, sometimes informally, with postcard writing parties, things that you post for different groups on social media, and just continuing to talk to your friends and your neighbors.
Thank you. So this is a question that I have, especially after seeing what has happened with the Redistricting Commission. So I would say, my question is, what would you say to people who essentially question the efficacy of the Supreme Court when they make rulings and then they're completely ignored by the legislature or the Redistricting Commission, and then nothing happens to those people? There are no punishments. And then we end up voting under illegal maps according to the Supreme Court, decision. So this personally to me was very disheartening that nothing happened. And what do you say to that? At what point does the Supreme Court lose any, power that they have if nothing gets, if someone breaks the law against what they decided?
That one bothered me a lot in 2021 and 2022. The reason I ran for the Ohio Supreme Court in 2020, because honestly I had been an appeals court judge from 2014 until I was elected to the Supreme Court, and I sat one time by assignment because Court of Appeals judges, if a Supreme Court justice has to recuse themselves for some kind of a conflict in a case, I was appointed by Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor in 2016 to sit by assignment on the Ohio Supreme Court. And I honestly thought to myself, oh, get me back to my court. This is way too political here. And so David Pepper, when he was chair, had asked me 3 different times to run for the Supreme Court. The third time I only said yes, because I wanted to be a part of any challenges to the new constitutional provisions for redistricting at both the state and the federal levels. There were ways I was able to contribute to the process of how we actually heard those cases, but I was not chief and able to make the ultimate decision on steering procedurally how we handled that case. Unfortunately, I don't know when we issued an order to show cause why parties involved were not in contempt of court. It got their attention. That was issued by the chief. But in the end, there was a corollary federal lawsuit going on, and it was actually the federal court that we would have kept going. We found things unconstitutional 7 times, and we would have kept going. But the federal court, because there were federal elections involved, ordered that the case, that basically the elections proceed with a delayed primary date, and there was really nothing more that we could do about it. There could have been, I don't believe there were, I think there were not 2 separate elections, because there could have been 2 separate elections. The Ohio Supreme Court, in terms of contempt powers, we don't have our own jail. Maybe we could have used the Franklin County Jail. That's what the federal U.S. District Attorney and the federal courts sometimes do. But again, I had seen that there were probably some things in the rules of civil procedure that we might have been able to use, but it wasn't up to me to be able to do that. But again, I also was very disappointed, and you can tell if you read my dissent, in some of our own officials who were on the Redistricting Commission who didn't follow what was in the Constitution in terms of determining the percentage of Democrat to Republican voting patterns in the state, because it has to be over a 10-year period. And the very first time that the Redistricting Commission came up with that percentage, they did what they used to do always on what was the apportionment board, which was to cut a deal, to cut a political deal. Because the year that I think it would be Ed Fitzgerald ran as our gubernatorial candidate, Democrats lost badly. But the year that Barack Obama won his second term for the presidency, Republicans lost badly. So how they came up with that percentage, I'm not really sure, but it wasn't done mathematically calculated to the way it was required to be done in the Constitution. And then this last time with redistricting, the parties, the last two times, the parties sort of cut a deal. And you know, some people say, don't make perfect the enemy of the good, but when you have to take an oath that you're going to follow the laws and the Constitution of the state of Ohio and of the United States, it doesn't matter how it comes out, you have to follow the law. And you know, you'll hear judges say, I didn't want to vote that way, but I followed the law. And there's the statutory law, which are they're more like rules of conduct that, if you take it sort of theoretically, part of the role of the legislature is to sort of reflect the morals of our society. And that's why redistricting, when there's gerrymandering, is so morally wrong, because you're not getting a true, fair representation of what the moral views are of your community. The Constitution sets the overall schema of your government, and so the Supreme Court its jurisdiction is defined by the Constitution, whereas the appellate and the trial courts, the legislature can say what they're allowed to hear and what their jurisdiction is, but the Supreme Court looks over all of that and works, of course, to make things as fair and just as possible so that people actually believe that justice exists. And you know, have we fallen short in government? Yes, because it's made up of humans, but we all know that humans can be amazing in their greatness and unbelievably debauched in their evil. So but again, you're here, you're looking to elect people that are going to be the best of all of us, and we hope that's where we can come out. I want to say one more thing on that. You know, there is the possibility that if there is a Democratic U.S. Senate and a Democratic U.S. House, we might not have Trump for 4 years. But it has to be people who have courage. And I think someplace in Tolstoy, courage really is one of the higher forms of love. And so just remember that. And you're looking for who you're going to support. You may feel like, I got to go with the establishment, or I should vote in the other side's primary so that it'll be easier for our side to win. No. You know, when I was asked early on, and I'm not giving an endorsement, but you know, there was the question of who was going to be in the gubernatorial primary this year. And you know, I, for one, was of the opinion that I don't care who wins or loses, I'm going to vote for the person who I think is really good and who I really believe in, because I've been at it so long, I'm tired of supporting the people that the establishment says we should support. And so that person I was thinking about is our candidate. So I have a lot of hope. I mean, she's holding her own between her opponent, and you know, she could very well be the first woman governor of Ohio. Wouldn't that be something? Any other questions?
Yes, so we have another audience question. Can you talk about qualified immunity and the petition out now to get rid of it in Ohio?
Okay, so qualified immunity is, there's originally this concept that, think about it, if you sue the government and the government has to pay money and damages for every time it gets sued, then we lose the ability of government to actually do its job for everyone. But there are now, so in the common law, meaning in the case law, there is this concept of qualified immunity. But the Ohio legislature has carved out exceptions to qualified immunity. That's why in Ohio we have a special court called the Court of Claims. And so if you want to sue a government entity, let's say you go to OSU Hospital in Columbus and they really botch it up, or maybe there's any number of things. Or I can remember one case we had on the Court of Appeals, and the 10th District Court of Appeals in Franklin County is the only appellate court that hears appeals from the Court of Claims. So if you have this case against the state, it's brought before the Court of Claims, which is a specialized court that deals only with cases against the state. It could be a case against the police, it could be a case against the fire department. I remember this case where the fire department, something went wrong with the truck and it sprayed a bunch of chemicals on somebody. And the Court of Claims can say, yes, you get compensation, or no, you don't. Then there's an appeal to the 10th District Court of Appeals, and an appeal beyond that to the Ohio Supreme Court. So, it's a balance. With qualified immunity, again, usually the standard has to be not just negligent, but reckless or even almost purposeful. But people do prove their cases. It's a tough one. So when you've got, I heard a lot of this after George Floyd about we need to get rid of qualified immunity, but I don't think there's people who are saying that. It might be different from state to state, and I think we just have to make sure that we elect judges, especially at the Supreme Court, especially for Chief Justice, who are going to put good, qualified people on the Court of Claims. You realize that if the case is complicated enough, let's say it's a huge medical malpractice case that's very, 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 very tedious, very technical, the Chief Justice has the ability to put more than one judge on that case. I don't know in my lifetime of being an attorney for going on 43 years that I've ever seen. Have you, Rick? More than one judge on a case in the Court of Claims? But again, if you elect people who are focused on doing the work and being a good public servant, they're going to read what their responsibilities are, what the limits of their power are. And I know when I was Secretary of State, I had to take out the entire Cuyahoga County Board of Elections and literally fire them because they had some of their top people committing election fraud, being convicted for it and sentenced to 18 months in prison each. And I remember I sat there and I said, oh, somebody had to do something about that. And I said, well, that would be you. And so, being a girl, I was a little more, I didn't just go in with a big stick like what I would have seen my grandfather do. I just called all 4 of them up on a Sunday night when I knew they would probably, and this is back in 2007, before when people actually answered their phones, but I called them up on a Sunday night and just said, I'd like for you to resign, and if you don't, I'm going to remove you. And all but one resigned, and then finally he did too. He happened to be the chair of the Ohio Republican Party. He filed a lawsuit and finally he gave it up, but you've got to have people who are willing to do their jobs and to do it fairly and judiciously and to do it as right as they can possibly do it.
Thank you. So, gonna say, I'm sorry. Last question I ask everybody: how can we support you? What do you want us to do for you?
Well, thank you. I have a website. It's justicebrunner.com. Also, jenniferbrunner.com will get you there too. Please drive volunteers, contributors to that website. I prefer to I won't turn down a large contribution, but I prefer a lot of small contributions from a lot of people, because I think the way that I view it is, for every one contribution I get, that's going to be probably 5 votes. Because if that person thought enough to contribute to my campaign, they're going to tell maybe 4 people. I also like the fact that by getting a large number of small contributions, I don't get distracted by, in making my decision on cases that are before me about who I need to at least be conscious of. And look, judges are human beings, and so, you know, if it was a large contributor, they might realize, oh, this case involves them, and then they have to say to themselves, like you do if you're on a diet and you don't want to eat candy, we're not going there. And so, for me, it's just easier that I don't have to worry about anything. If I have a lot of people who are interested in my background, what they think that I can do as far as public service goes, and I will mention to you that surprisingly to me, in 2008, I got a call from Caroline Kennedy asking me if I would be willing to accept the Profile and Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum. And I had gotten tipped off the day before by one of the county commissioners, Tim Hagan in Cuyahoga County, who was friends with Ted Kennedy at the time. And I just remember when he called me, I was like, oh, I think I've heard of that award. And he's saying Senator Kennedy. I'm like, I think there's just one of them. And then you know, I got off the phone and I told Rick and I told my mom, and they were like, Jennifer. So actually, Caroline had called into the Secretary of State's office through the business services line, and one of my line people, Liza, took the call, and she said to her supervisor, Caroline Kennedy just called here today, and the supervisor said she did not. and so they transferred the call to my assistant, Erin, and Erin set this phone call, and at the time I had one of those pink Blackberries, and she called at the appointed time, and I said, it's so good to hear your voice. But when she asked me if I'd be willing to accept it, I was like, yeah, I would. And so this involved walking into their gala at the center to heralding trumpets. And of course, I had this dress that I bought at Bergdorf Goodman because I thought, you know, it was like a black tie. And it had these two little trains in the back. And Rick, of course, was walking behind me and would step on it, and I'd go like this. Which made Vicki Kennedy laugh. But anyways, I'm just saying that you know, you can tell people that the first person who got one of these was me from Ohio, and the second person was Amy Acton. So, and hers was a COVID one. Yes. So, just tell them, like, you know, even small amounts, we'll take it. And any volunteers, we'll be glad to keep you busy. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, folks, we have one more candidate for you.